Let's look at cranial nerves, but not from an identification standpoint. Let's look at them from understanding the order plus what is their function. Remember, we have two primary functions, sensory and motor. Some cranial nerves are just sensory. They could be special sensory. Some are just motor, meaning they react. Some do both, meaning they're mixed. So we need to understand their basic function. So this video is focusing not necessarily on where do you find them, but the order from 1 to 12, but also what is their basic function. I put this video in because I see a lot of mnemonics out there of how do we remember them. And I'm not a big fan of mnemonics. I think it's some type of distraction in learning the material, because by the time you learn a mnemonic, you could have just learned the structures. I am hypocritical. Sometimes I will use them, and I give you an example where I do use them, but I want you to avoid from learning something new that has nothing to do with the topic of anatomy. An example that I just searched on the internet is I found a mnemonic to understand the flow of all my nerves that says, on occasion, our trusty truck acts funny, very good vehicle anyhow. What the hell are they even talking about? Why would we create something like this? Not only does it not make any sense, it doesn't have any associated with anatomical structures, and now you're remembering something new when you could just learn the structures. I'm a big fan when you learn anatomy and simplify it, do it in groups of 3s and 4s. Since we have 12 nerves, I put it in 3 groups of 4. Try to practice understanding and learning. How do you learn it? Teach it to others. Breaking things down rather than adding a mnemonic. Then I'll give you a mnemonic that I think can help you, but I'm cautious with even using them because I still try to avoid it. So let's look at our 12 pairs of cranial nerves. When we look at them, a lot of mnemonics will start out with O and then T, but you got to remember the O's. So how does that help you? O. Let's just go through olfactory, optic, and then I separate oculomotor and trochlear. I keep the trigeminal separate than trochlear because there's 2 T's there, but I just put this in groups of 4. Let's just go through olfactory, optic, ocular motor, and trochlear. That's it. Start by just remembering those 4. How do I do it? I teach it to you. Olfactory, optic, ocular motor, and trochlear. And then we're trying to associate what do they do by function. So I did add this mnemonic that says some say money matters, and I'm using the first letter to indicate is it sensory or motor. For the first 4, I don't even use this mnemonic. I just learned SSMM. So now I have my first 4 covered. So I look at olfactory, sensory, optic, sensory, ocular motor, it says it in the word, motor, and then trochlear is motor. So I learned those first 4, SSMM. Let's look at a picture of that to then describe what do they actually do. Olfactory, it's just a special sense, right? That I only use it for olfaction, which is my ability to smell molecules and what's breathing in through my nose. So olfaction, just our special sensory. Number 2, optic, we also said was sensory, but a special sense. It does optic, which is vision, so primarily vision. Ocular motor, the ability to use my eyes. My superior rectus, the muscle on top to erect and look up, inferior to look down, my medial to look inward, and then my inferior oblique. So I'm using these 4 primary muscles. Then you start to look at number 4, which is trochlear, also eye movement. What I want you to remember is 3, 4, and 6 do eye movement. So it's a motor function, 3, 4, and 6. We still got to get to abducens, which is number 6. So 3, ocular motor, trochlear, motor movement, because we said it was SSMM. Eye movement, what is it moving? Superior oblique only. What do we mean by that? It's innervating or act upon that muscle for the superior oblique. So we go back to it. We did those 4. Now let's get to the next 4. I separate the ones with 2 T's. That helps me to remember it better. Trochlear was our last one that we did in our first group. Now we're moving on to trigeminal because it actually branches into 3 segments. Abducens, then facial, then vestibulocochlear. Trigeminal, abducens, number 7 is facial, number 8 is vestibulocochlear. Now let's look at this. I remember BMBS. Some people say, in my own mind, bowel movement, bull, BMBS. So I had SSMM, BMBS. If it helps you, I'd rather you do it that way than rather learn a mnemonic. So trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, BMBS. What does the B mean? That it does both sensory and motor. Now it gets a little complicated, okay? BMBS. So let's look at these. Trigeminal is primarily motor. That's mastication, which means chewing. It's impacting or innervating on the masses or muscle so I can chew and talk. Sensory, some of our basic sensory information of the face. So it's doing both motor and sensory. Abducens, abduct, to take away. We're back to eye movement. So it only does motor because we said BMBS. Motor, to use our lateral rectus to look away. So lateral rectus. Remember I said eye movement is 3, 4, and 6. So oculomotor, trochlear, abducens. Facial. Facial does quite a bit. First, sensory. We just call that basic for taste. We'll get into special senses later. But now we can break down our 2 different types of motor. Remember when we talked about our sensory and motor, one of our early breakdowns of the nervous system, we said there's visceral and somatic. Visceral is what I typically am going on inside my body that I don't have conscious control over. Somatic is what I can voluntarily control. So somatic motor is some of my facial expressions. Visceral motor, things I can't control. So when I look at my tears and my lacrimal glands, when I secrete mucus, when I look at salivary glands, the saliva in my mouth, these are glands that are secreting a product. I cannot control these. And then when we get into our autonomic nervous system, we see these interacting with these nerves. So facial does quite a bit. Then we go back to vestibular, which is just a sensory, a third special sensory. We did olfactory number 1, optic number 2. Those are special sensory. Now we get into vestibulocochlear to handle my balance, equilibrium, and my hearing. We'll learn when we cover special senses that vestibulocochlear can be divided into 2 branches, a vestibular branch and a cochlear branch, but they come together to become cranial nerve number 8. So as we describe these, we're looking at, do they sensory and motor? So if we go back to what we had, we got TAFV, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear. So we got our 4 and 4, last 4. Hang in there. Glossopharyngeal, vagus. So I always remember we go to Vegas. I use the G, we're going to Vegas, like Las Vegas. Glossopharyngeal, referring to the tongue and throat, we're going to Vegas. We'll learn that the vagus nerve does quite a bit of branching through my body. Accessory kind of goes off course, but it's just doing some of my voluntary control of my skeletal muscles of the neck. And then hypoglossal, referring around the tongue. So hypo, when we refer to below the tongue. When we go back to this, so we did SSMM, we did BMBS, now we're doing BBMM. So I like the order of this, and we get that they're both motor. So we got BBMM at this point. Glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, hypoglossal. BBMM. Let's take a look at those. Glossopharyngeal. So we said BBMM, so both. So it handles some of the information coming from the medulla oblongata. We covered some of the things in medulla oblongata, including breathing, inhalation, exhalation. When it covers some of the things, the crazy things it does, like sneezing, coughing, hiccuping. Somatic motor and visceral motor. Somatic motor is control for some of our swallowing. When we look at visceral, the parotid salivary gland on the side here that contributes to saliva. When you chew something sour and you feel that tingling, that's parotid salivary gland. Mumps, the virus, is associated with the parotid salivary gland. So glossopharyngeal, it does both, sensory and motor. Vagus, I've shortened this quite a bit, but the vagus does quite a bit. So cranial nerve number 10 branches all the way into thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. So as I branch, it's going to do a lot of sensory information for all the activity for thoracic, abdominal, pelvic cavity. So any of my breathing, my heart, my digestive system. The vagus is also considered one of the fainting nerves that's controlling the weight where we're bringing oxygen in the body. So when we lock our knees at a wedding or some ceremony and somebody faints, that's typically in conjunction with the vagus nerve. Somatic motor, muscles of the palate, my mouth and my pharynx, my throat. Visceral motor, all the things we need to do for respiratory system to control breathing. Cardiovascular system, the way the heart is controlling the way we contract and relax in conjunction with the intrinsic conduction system. The way we're moving food through our digestive tract. So it does quite a bit, both sensory and motor, throughout a lot of our body through thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. Accessory is now motor, hypoglossal is motor, and we're just getting into muscle movements. Muscles of our neck like sternocleidomastoid, from the sternum and clavicle up to the mastoid process. My major trap muscles, okay, that move around the scapula. We control those, so it's a somatic motor control using accessory. And then lastly, for the tongue, below the tongue, glossal is referring to the tongue, the ability to move my tongue, hypoglossal. So we're learning glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, lastly hypoglossal, BBMM. Try to do this and break it down the best you can. I prefer you not learn mnemonics. I've seen students write these out and learn these. You're not actually learning. You're memorizing something to memorize something else. A lot of times I feel like you're wasting your time. Try to put things into groups. No different than this topic, but any other topic, especially when you get into things like muscles. Put them into categories based on the areas and what they do. I try to simplify anatomy as best I can. In this, I have a study guide that helps break this down for you to practice with. So as we look at cranial nerves, break them down for the 12 pairs. This is the cranial nerves.